Today I want to talk about learning related or similar languages. Is it an advantage to learn a language that's similar to one that you already know? And are there some problems with that? First of all, as we learn a new language, of course, we relate everything new to something that we know. If we just take the language full of words and sounds we've never heard before and we can't relate it to something that we know, something that we're familiar with, if we don't have that something, we're not going to learn. So we relate things back to things that we already know. And as we progress in a language and we see new words that are different forms or changed forms of words that we already know, the fact that we see these words that are familiar to what we already know, that helps us learn. And of course, we gain confidence as we continue learning the language. And then we push the envelope into things that we don't know, and they eventually become things that we know. And if we keep going, we will inevitably improve as we learn a language. So, that being the case, if we learn a similar language, that should be an advantage. And of course it is. Because the biggest sort of task in language learning is to acquire words. Well, if 50, 60, 70% of the words of a new language are similar or identifiable, that should make it easier. French, for example, half of the vocabulary is identifiable from English or vice versa. So those languages, for that reason, are easier to learn, say for an English speaker to learn French as opposed to Greek or Chinese. So that is a big advantage. And there are many examples. It's not just English and French. It's obviously the Romance languages. If you know Spanish, it's easier to learn Italian or Portuguese. If you know Russian, it's easier to learn Czech or Ukrainian or Polish. And even encountering this in the case of Arabic, where having started with Fusha, which is standard Arabic, I now take all of that vocabulary and familiarity with how the Arabic language works in a way and apply that to, say, Levantine Arabic, which is in many ways quite different. However, what I want to point out is that there are some pitfalls. There are some difficulties. First of all, when we learn a language and then start to speak in a language, there are sort of three things that happen in our brain as we try to produce an utterance. First of all, there is a word that will come to mind in the language, and we'll throw that out there because we're comfortable using it. And apparently we then go to a structure that we have used before. So presumably at some point we threw a structure out there, it worked, so we want to use that structure again. But another important part of what the brain does, it suppresses things that don't belong. And that's an important part of, developing that ability to speak in a language. So what happens if the languages are very closely related, at least in my experience, I find it more difficult to suppress those things from related languages that don't belong. When I speak Portuguese, for example, I'm accused of speaking portunhol.
Eu comecei com a língua espanhola. Então, é difícil para mim criar as conexões neurônicas no cérebro para falar melhor em português, porque tem essa influência da língua espanhola.
There's a lot of Spanish pronunciation, Spanish phraseology or structure, Spanish vocabulary. Even some Italian. So those things tend to kind of get a bit mixed. Now, hopefully if I were in a purely Portuguese-speaking environment, then I would speak more Portuguese and less Portuñol. Similarly with these other pairs, these other like Slavic language groups, and similarly with Standard Arabic and say Levantine Arabic. Now, it doesn't hamper comprehension. And if we remember that comprehension is the sort of core skill upon which all other skills are built, then if you understand well and you still confuse them a little bit, it's not a big deal. Another example of this learning similar languages is the example of Romanian. Romanian, for me, was very easy. I had the advantage that it had, say, 70% vocabulary that was similar to Romance languages. Another 20% is apparently of Slavic or of some Balkan area languages. But 70% is from the Romance base. But the structure is quite different. And so therefore it was easier for me to suppress things that didn't belong. So blessings and disadvantages, primarily it's a blessing. The sort of determining factor of how easy a language to learn still remains how similar the languages are and how similar the vocabulary is. But you can't take it for granted. And it's sometimes very difficult Once you have acquired, let's say in my case, Spanish, and I put myself into a Spanish frame of mind, and I've learned to imitate Spanish, it's almost like I'm an actor playing that role, and now I'm asked to play this other role, this Portuguese role. It's difficult to do. So comprehension is good. Getting to where you speak that other language well is something that I have found difficult to do. Other people, I know a lot of excellent polyglots who are sounding close to native in related languages, so it may just be a problem that I have, but I thought it would be interesting to share this with you. And I look forward to your comments. Bye.